Hello. Today we are going to discuss Chapter 20, which is process costing. So as your memory may serve you, in Chapter 19 we looked at job costing. So basically job costing and process costing is looking at two different ways to track our direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead costing. When we looked at job costing in Chapter 19, we noted that you could only use job costing if you're going to provide a very unique service or a very unique product. So, how do we track costs such as direct materials, direct labor, or overhead for mass production? And that's where process costing comes in. So today we're going to focus primarily on process costing, and I would say it's a little bit trickier than job costing. There's a lot more steps to it. So when do we use process costing? So as I mentioned, process costing is going to be used when we are doing mass production. So anytime we're creating the same product over and over, and basically in a continuous manufacturing setting. So what types of examples would use process costing? Well, this would be any textiles, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, so General Mills, Pepsi, etc. Basically anything we use in our day-to-day lives is process costing. It's mass production. And why is process costing going to be a little bit more challenging than job costing? Well, job costing, we're tracking the cost per unique service. So we know when the product starts and when the product is finished, when it's completed. With process costing, because we're looking at a manufacturing setting, and if you've ever worked in a factory, or both of my parents are blue-collar workers, they worked in factories, you have production happening all the time. So at any given moment, if I went into the plant, I would see products that's finished, I would see products that's halfway done, and I would see products that haven't began at all. All right. So because we always in a manufacturing setting, because we always have products in multiple stages of the completion process, it's why it gets a little tricky. So basically what we're going to be doing is remember those good old cost flow formulas from, I believe it was Chapter 18, where we looked at raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. Well, remember when we looked at work in process, we looked at the formula and we said it was going to be the beginning balance, and we was going to add our direct materials, add our labor, add our overhead. We would subtract out all of our cost of goods manufactured, which is all of our completed products, and have our ending balance. Well, basically, and up until now, these numbers such as cost of goods manufactured and ending balance has been given to you. What we're going to do today is show how those numbers are calculated. Because in the real world, they're just not going to be given to you. You're going to have to back into them. So what we're going to be doing is looking at product costs such as DM, DL, and manufacturing overhead, and taking the cost that we have in our products and dividing it up to the products that we have completed and they're ready for sale. So they're 100% finished, nothing left to be done. And then we're also going to take this cost and divide it up to the goods that's remaining, this ending balance, in work in process that aren't finished yet, that we will have to finish at another time. So it gets tricky because we're going to be dealing with goods that aren't fully completed. So with process costing, it differs a little bit by job costing. By job costing, we tracked all the costs by a particular job or product. With process costing, we're going to track the cost by a department. So let me show you how this would work. So let's go to the next page. So if we were looking at how to make orange juice, let's say there's 3 departments associated with orange juice. Department number 1. We're going to track all the costs associated with this department. So this would include washing the oranges, peeling them, sorting them, and that probably should say inspecting instead of expecting, inspecting the oranges. So we would track all the costs associated with that one department. Then the next department, we would track all the costs associated with crushing the oranges, straining the pulp. And not only would we track the cost with crushing and straining the pulp, but we'd also include the cost from department number 1. So as we move from one department to the next, we're bringing along our cost as well. And then the last department, department number 3, we're going to track all the costs associated with mixing the juice and bottling it. And once again, not only are we going to include these costs for mixing and bottling, but we're going to include the costs that we had to crush and strain the pulp and to wash, peel, and sort. So time we get to department number 3, we have all of the costs from the previous departments. So when I mentioned earlier that process costing, when we're tracking the cost by department, this is what I'm looking at. So time we get to the 3rd department, we will have all the costs associated with making the orange juice. So as I mentioned, how it gets really kind of tricky is if we were still looking at this problem, the costs associated with making the orange juice, we have to divide that total cost up between the finished bottles of orange juice and the unfinished bottles. So in other words, when we're looking at making the orange juice, we're not tracking the individual cost of every bottle of orange juice that comes down the assembly line. That would be chaotic. That would be insane. It would be about impossible. So what happens instead is that a company will track the cost by department. And let's say they do this on a monthly basis. So at the end of the month, they say, all right, all of the direct materials, direct labor, and overhead costs we had as making orange juice was this dollar amount. Then it's up to the accountants, or you, to decide, all right, well, how much of that dollar amount should be associated with the finished bottles, and how much of that should be associated with the unfinished bottles. So before we can answer that question, we need to learn a very important term, which is called equivalent units. So because I remember we just said up above that we have to divide this cost up to some unfinished bottles, that gets hairy. Well, if we're looking at finished bottles of orange juice to unfinished bottles, we can't compare apples to apples. They're not the same thing, correct? So we got to use the term equivalent units to be able to get everything on the same playing field. So remember when you learned fractions back as a kid, and when you're adding fractions, you learned you had to have the same denominator. You couldn't add different denominators. Same thing here. Basically, we need to turn everything, those half bottles of orange juices and those full bottles of orange juices, to the same denominator on the same level. So let's say we had worked on 3 finished bottles of orange juice. And I'm not an artist, hence why I'm a CPA. So I'm just going to draw a square and fill it in to show that we have worked on 3 bottles of orange juice. I would say the equivalent units of production for those 3 bottles of orange juice would also be 3 equivalent units, 3 fully bottles of orange juice. But let's say we have 2 bottles of orange juice that's only 50% complete. This is the orange juice left in the inventory and will be finished at another time. So to show that they're not fully complete, I'm going to draw 2 little squares and fill it in halfway. Once again, I'm not an artist. Well, the equivalent units of that, if I combine my efforts of the completed portions of each bottle of orange juice, so I have 50% of one bottle of orange juice completed and 50% of another, if I combine those completed efforts, that's the same as saying I have 1 full bottle of orange juice. Correct? I don't know if you're like me, but I'm really bad to drink bottles of water and I never finish one. So I end up looking in my refrigerator and there's like 5 bottles of partially finished water. So what do? I start combining them to, put them into whole bottles. Same thing here. I get 2 bottles of orange juice that's halfway full. I combine them and make that 1 bottle. And we're going to call that 1 equivalent unit. So what an equivalent unit is basically combining the efforts of the finished portions. And if we combine them all, saying, what would it be if we combine all of our finished efforts? How many whole units would that make? So therefore, 2 bottles that's 50% complete is the equivalent of 1 fully complete bottle of orange juice. So now, what I've turned is apples and oranges to apples and apples. They're on the same level. So now I can say the total units worked on 3 full bottles of orange juice and 2 partially finished bottles of orange juice is the same as working on 4 equivalent units or 4 full bottles of orange juice. So because we have to have that common denominator like I spoke about previously, we're going to use equivalent units. So on the right side of the sheet, I have everything in the same unit, the same measurement. So next we're going to talk about the steps for basically preparing a departmental production report. And that is just a fancy word for saying how are we going to divide up this direct material, direct labor, and overhead costs to the finished goods that we completed to the unfinished goods that's still left in inventory that still needs to be worked on. Now, I will tell you in advance that your book does this slightly differently. You're more than welcome to use the book's method, or you may use my method. Part of the reason why we do these recorded lectures is because if I was just reiterating everything straight from the textbook, you wouldn't need me. You could just read the textbook. I'm going to show you sometimes a different spin on how to do something, and then you can decide which method works best for your learning. So the first step, we have to account for the physical flow of the units through the department. So we need to be able to answer the questions. How many actual units were in beginning inventory? So how many units were in beginning inventory that we need to complete? How many new units did we start this month? So and I worked at Texas Instruments, they would call this, I had to run a report every Monday. That was the start report. So we could see what was the new production that we started the past week. So this is what's the new production did we start. The third question we have to be able to answer, how many units were completed and transferred out? All right? And then finally, how many units were unfinished left in any inventory, in other words, that needs to be finished at a later date? So we first have to answer those 4 questions. Then we have to calculate the equivalent units of production. So we got to compare apples to apples. So basically we have to answer the question, how many units would there be if all efforts of direct material, direct labor, and overhead resulted in completed units? And don't worry, I'm going to give you a template here that really helps put all this information together. So in other words, you can't do step 2 without actually doing step 1 first. Then this is very critical, the most important piece. We have to compute the cost per equivalent unit. Don't let that word equivalent unit throw you, okay? Basically, remember when we would say the direct material cost per unit is, etc., that's all we're doing. So for example, if I had $6 of flour when I made 12 cookies, I would say the dollar amount of flour I have for every cookie is 50 cents. That's all we're doing here. How much direct material cost do we have for every equivalent unit? The word equivalent unit throws you, just think of the word unit. How much labor cost do we have for every equivalent unit? And how much overhead cost do we have per every equivalent unit? So this, step number 3 is critical, because if this is incorrect, everything else. And then the final step is we're going to actually do what we've been looking at so far, and you're probably sick of looking at it. Take those direct material, direct labor, and overhead costs and divide it up to the finished goods and the ending inventory, which is what step 4 is dictating. So the only way we can do this is dive into a problem. So online, I've provided you with a template that you're going to use. I'm going to use the Excel template while I'm teaching this online. So give me 1 second. Let me make sure I'm sharing my entire desktop with you so you can see my template. So what we're going to be looking at is Carolina cornmeal. And she produces a product that goes through 2 sequential processing departments, the drying and the grinding department. In the grinding department, all materials are added at the beginning of the process. So right now that doesn't mean anything to you, but do me a favor and highlight that portion or somehow mark it so you know to come back to it later. Then all conversion costs, and as a little friendly reminder, conversion costs includes direct labor and overhead are added uniformly during the process. The following activities relate to the grinding department for August. So this tells us that beginning work in process on August 1st consisted of 200,000 grams. So this is cornmeal. So this beginning work in process, those 200,000 grams, they're not ready yet. They're not finished. Okay, if they were finished, they wouldn't be in beginning work in process. They would be in finished goods. So cost in beginning work in process as follows. We have direct materials of 55,000, direct labor of 15,000, and overhead of 30,000. So these total costs here is what we have in those 200,000 grams of cornmeal up to this point. So once again, the cornmeal is not finished, so we're going to have to add more cost to finish them. But up until now, we have this amount of money in the cornmeal. Then 400,000 grams were started into production during August. So this was new production that we started. And then finally, ending work in process on August 31st consisted of 100,000 grams. So anything left in ending work in process, just like beginning work in process, it's unfinished. So at the end of the month, everything was said and done. They had 100,000 grams of cornmeal that was not finished. It said 60% complete as to conversion cost. And as a reminder, conversion cost is your overhead and direct labor. And then it tells us the following costs were added during the month. We had direct materials, direct labor, and overhead cost. So question A says, prepare a physical flow schedule for the grinding department's work in process for the month of August. So what you're going to do is pull up the process costing template that is on Blackboard. And I have an electronic version of this. This template is going to be your lifesaver. All right, this is going to provide you with the steps that you need to do to solve these problems. And the past students have been very, very grateful for these templates. I cannot take credit for them. It's actually a template one of my accounting professors back in the day used. So this is what we're going to do. Step 1A here is the physical flow. And this is going to answer question A, prepare a physical flow schedule for the grinding department's work in process for the month of August. So remember previously, I'm going to scroll up here, we said we need to be able to answer for step 1 these 4 questions. We're going to be able to do that in this physical flow. So beginning inventory. So this physical flow is all in units. So we had 200,000 grams to begin with in beginning inventory. And then it says we started 400,000 grams. All right. So the total I need to account for, if I add up the units added in beginning inventory, is 600,000 grams. Here's a nice little trick. This total to account for has to be the same in both areas. So if I already know my total to account for is 600,000 grams, I can automatically fill that in. Now, it tells us that any work in process on August 31st consisted of 100,000 grams. So where it says in any work in process, I'm going to write 100,000 grams. So now the only piece I need to answer, we know how much inventory we had to begin with. We know how many units we started. And we know how many units we had left in ending inventory. What we don't know is how many grams of cornmeal did they complete. When it says transferred out, that means they completed them and transferred out. Well, because I know that the total to account for has to equal 600,000, I can back into this number by taking the 600,000 less what we had left in ending inventory and calculate that they had completed 500,000 grams of cornmeal. So this answers step A. Question 2 states for us to compute the equivalent units of production for August. So basically, remember, I'm going to scroll up here. When we were doing this, we need to do this for this. So if we transferred out these 500,000 units, that means that they were complete, all right? So that means my equivalent units for anything transferred out is going to be the same. We completed 500,000 units. That means we had to complete 500,000 units in regards to all the materials. That means we had to complete 500,000 units in regards to all of our labor costs. And we had to complete 500,000 units in regards to our overhead cost. So what we're doing now is saying how much did we complete of these 500,000 units for each of the 3 categories of product cost. So when we're looking at units transferred out, these are completed, so the number is always going to be the same across the board. It's ending inventory that gets tricky because ending inventory is not finished. We're dealing with this part right here in B. So we have to turn these partially finished units into completed units for materials, labor cost, and overhead cost. So let's go back to our problem. So remember I said earlier that I had you highlight or point out that we're going to need this sentence, all materials are added at the beginning of the process? Well, now we're going to use that. And also note down here, it says there's 60% complete as to conversion cost. Well, if my product is 60% complete, and I know that all materials are added at the beginning of the process, that means all materials are already complete. So how do I know that? Okay, let's say I come to you and you say, hey Sheila, I have some cookies in the oven. They're not done yet, all right? Should be done in about 15 minutes. Well, I can automatically know that since the cookies are in the oven, that means you've finished all of the materials portion, because there's no way the cookies could have got to that step of being in the oven unless you've added all the ingredients. So I know then that all of the material portion of the cookies are 100% complete. Same thing here. Since all materials are added at the beginning of the process, for the 100,000 grams of cornmeal to even be somewhat complete, the materials had to been already done. So that means whenever you see all materials are added at the beginning of the process, that means that they were 100% complete. But labor costs and overhead costs is a different story. For labor costs and overhead costs, it tells us 60% complete as to conversion cost. And remember, conversion cost is labor and overhead. So I have 100,000 of these units. That's only 60% complete. If I take 100,000 times 60%, that's the equivalent of saying I have 60,000 equivalent units completed in regards to labor cost. All right? And then the same thing for overhead. If I have 100,000 units, that's 60% complete. That's the equivalent of 60,000 units completed in regards to overhead cost. So now my next step is to add up the total equivalent units I've worked on. So for materials, I worked on a total equivalent units of 600,000. For labor cost, I worked on a total of 560,000 equivalent units. And for overhead, I worked on a total of 560,000 equivalent units. Just take a deep breath. If you need to pause me and go back and rewind, because the equivalent unit portion is very critical. So prop B, this is what we just did right here. Part C wants us to compute the cost per equivalent unit for both direct materials and conversion costs. So before we get to that, we had to do some other steps. So this part down here, cost computations, is going to be all dollars. So if you want to make a note, everything from C, D, and E will always be in dollars. So here we're just throwing in numbers that's given to us. So this is telling us we went here from beginning work in process to total up the total dollar amount we had in our beginning inventory. So we had 55,000 of direct material costs attached to beginning inventory. We had 15,000 of direct labor cost and 30,000 of overhead cost. So if I total this up, the total amount of money we had in beginning inventory is $100,000. So once again, all I'm doing right now is showing how much money we had in beginning inventory. Then we want to throw in the dollar amounts that we added this period. So we added, if I look down here, we added $145,000 of direct materials. Then we added $109,200 of direct labor. And then we added $165,000 of overhead cost. So now if I total this up, the total dollar amount that we added this period was $419,200. So if I sum this up, The total amount of money we have in this corn meal is $509,200. And I also want to total up the total amount of material cost, which was $200,000, the total amount of labor cost, which was $124,200, and the total amount of overhead, which was $195,000. And I'm just going to highlight these kind of in a light blue. Oops, that's not blue, is it? So this $519,000, this is critical. This is the total dollar amount. Remember when we've been looking at this fun little triangle up here? This $519,000 is the total dollar amount we're trying to divide up to those 500,000 grams of cornmeal that we completed and they're ready for sale, and the 100,000 that's left in any inventory. Because up until now, we don't know how much those 500,000 grams of cornmeal cost us. So now what I gotta do is calculate, which is to answer C's question, calculate the cost per equivalent unit. So what I'm gonna do, I need to know how much direct material cost do we have in every unit of cornmeal. So to do that, I'm gonna take the total amount of money I have in every gram of cornmeal and divide it by the total number of grams of cornmeal, the 600,000 that I worked on for direct materials. And I get 33 cents of, that's how much money, 33 cents of cornmeal, of direct material for every gram of cornmeal. Then labor cost, same thing. I had $124,200 of labor cost. I worked on a total of 560,000 grams of cornmeal in regards to labor. So that tells me I have 22 cents of labor cost in every gram of cornmeal. And then finally for overhead, I'm going to do the same thing. Take the total of 195,000 of overhead cost, divided by the 560,000 of grams of cornmeal we worked on for overhead, and it comes out I have 35 cents of overhead cost for every gram of cornmeal. And if I add this up for every equivalent unit I'm working on, I have 90 cents of product cost. So for question C, when it's asking compute the cost per equivalent unit for both direct materials and conversion costs, this is what I'm wanting. I have 33 cents, 22 cents, and 35 cents. Now the final part. We need to divide this $519,200 up to those 500,000 units that we completed and transferred out, or those 500,000 grams, and those 100,000 grams that are left in any inventory. So to do this, we're going to use these cost per equivalent units. So how much money do I have in those 500,000 grams of cornmeal? So I got to first calculate the direct material portion. So I have 33 cents of material for every equivalent unit I worked on. We worked on a total of 500,000 that we completed and transferred out. So I have $165,000 of material cost in those 500,000 units. Now, for labor, we know we have 22 cents for every equivalent unit. I worked on 500,000 equivalent units. So we have $110,000 of labor cost. And then finally for overhead, we have 35 cents per equivalent unit. I worked on a total of 500,000. So we have $175,000 of overhead cost. If I add this up, the total product cost of those 500,000 grams of cornmeal is $450,000. So now let's calculate how much money we have in those 100,000 grams. Once again, I have 33 cents in every equivalent unit, but I only worked on 100,000 of the equivalent units in any inventory. So I have $33,000 in material cost in the ending inventory. Labor cost, we have 22 cents for every equivalent unit, but I only worked on 60,000 equivalent units in ending inventory. So that comes to $13,200. And finally, we had 35 cents of overhead cost for equivalent unit, but we only worked on 60,000. So if we add this up, the total dollar amount is $67,200 that we have in ending inventory. Now, so if I add this up, I get $517,200. I know someone's thinking, wait a minute, I thought we were supposed to divide this $519,200 up. Yes, we are. But when we did these cost per equivalent units, we rounded it to decimals. So because of rounding, we're going to be slightly off. But if these two numbers are relatively close, then you've done your calculations correctly. The next problem we're going to take a look at here in a minute comes out perfectly. But once again, I rounded these numbers, so we're going to be slightly off. So now we know that we had $450,000 in this 500,000 grams of cornmeal and $67,200 in ending inventory in those 100,000 grams of cornmeal that we have not completed yet. So these here are our golden numbers that we're looking for.